Welcome to the Plant Report, a radio show that educates about the green world one plant at a time. The Plant Report is a new educational resource about plants, herbal medicine, ethnobotany, and the human-plant relationship. Listen to our podcast, read our blog, watch our videos, and learn from experts and the plants. The Plant Report is a project of Sustainable World Radio and is hosted by Jill Cloutier. Thanks for listening to the Plant Report because every plant has a story. Our plant today is Albizia julibrissin, and our guest is Lindsay Kolasa. Lindsay is a community herbalist, traditional food ways educator, and all-around amazing plant person. Lindsay ran the Sweet Gum Springs Apothecary in Mississippi for 5 years, and she has a background in print journalism and social service. And Lindsay's teachings and work, which we'll benefit from today, are a distillation of what she has learned along the way. You can find Lindsay online at lindsaykolasa.com. Welcome to the Plant Report, Lindsay.
Thank you.
Today we'll be chatting about my new plant crush, Albizia, which I adore this plant. I think I've seen it throughout my life, especially growing up in the South when I was really little. And I recently came across Albizia on a walk a couple of months ago, and I was so enchanted with its little pink puffball flowers and the gorgeous, uplifting fragrance. And I honestly can say standing under that tree for about 10 minutes made me very happy. And so I'm wondering if you could describe for listeners who may not know what tree we're talking about, Albizia julibrissin, can you describe this tree to our listeners?
Yes, Jill, and I'm so glad that this tree has been coming up for you as well. I know when I lived in Mississippi, it was everywhere. It is an invasive. And when I moved out to Santa Barbara, I was happy that, there were a handful of places where people had planted these trees. So it definitely lifted my mood just to see that it was a plant and a tree I could still work with out here. So this tree is, it can be a towering tree. It can grow pretty tall. Reaching for the sun and reaching for the top canopy of plants, are competing with other trees in an ecosystem. But if you plant it in your yard, it's a pretty average sized tree, and its branches can grow pretty low to the ground, making it a favorite for, young ones and kids. It's a tree that they often climb, and it makes sense once you get to know the medicine more of the tree, why they'd be so drawn to it as well. The leaves are, it's in the legume family, so Fabaceae. It's a nitrogen fixer, so it's also going to build the soil, and it has beautiful pink blossoms that just look puffy and feathery, and they're blooming through the thick of the summer. And the leaves, as our true legume trees are these small, rounded, almost feathery leaves along a stem. So there are these compound leaves. They also look feathery as well. Everything about the tree just seems whimsical and delightful, and also lends to how it's referred to in China and in traditional Chinese medicine, which is the tree of happiness, or full of happiness. The teacher that taught me about this tree when I was in Southern Appalachia, she just called it the happy tree.
Yeah, and it did work. It made me very happy. Now,
Yeah.
I know it's amazing. It was just so beautiful, and the fragrance. Oh my gosh. And I was so taken with it that I actually came home. I stalked it online obsessively for days, and my friends are really sick of hearing about it, I have to say.
Yeah.
And I have 2 tinctures going, and I have collected some stems. I want to collect bark, as I talked to you about, and I just adore it. But I do want to acknowledge too, because I know some people are listening right now and think, well, wait, this isn't it can be weedy, invasive plant. And not in every place, but I know in the South especially. And so can you tell us about Albizia as an invasive plant and what your thoughts are on this?
Yeah. So, first of all, I'm pretty sure it was back in the late 1700s that it was brought over. I think a man in Italy, actually, his last name is Albizia, so that's where the genus name comes from. He brought it over from Italy, and he had gotten a tree or a seed, I can't remember which, from Turkey. Anyway, it found its way to the Northeast in the late 1700s. Even Thomas Jefferson had some growing at Monticello. It has made its way into mostly the Southeast and some of the Southern Appalachian ranges, where it's most common. So, and I just want to say this about invasives, you know, wherever there has been destabilization of plant species due to human interaction, human disturbance, typically, invasives will take root. And it's interesting that depending on the invasive and depending on the situation, the invasives can actually mitigate harm to an ecosystem by their presence, whether it's through the nutrient cycle or, maybe stabilizing or becoming part of the mycorrhizal foundation in the soil, dropping leaves, as I said, with the nutrient aspect of their presence, dropping leaves and bringing more nutrition to the soil. There's a number of ways that these plants can play a part and play a role in bringing an ecosystem back to health. So there's a really great book called Invasive Plant Medicine by Timothy Lee Scott, and he writes more about this. Here's a quote from his book. By enhancing biodiversity, invasive exotic plants create healthier and more efficient ecosystems. So it's kind of hard for native plant enthusiasts to consider that, but I also want them to hold a little space and hold this thought and watch the ecosystem that they're seeing overrun with invasives and consider what led it to that point and consider what that plant's medicine has for we humans to correct an imbalance we have. So one of the best plants for Lyme's disease, one of the top plants, is Japanese knotweed, which happens to be all over the Northeast and into the Appalachian range. And I think it's no coincidence that it overlaps with the highest concentration of Lyme. So that's just an example. And later we'll find out what Mimosa has for us. I wish that our ecosystems were stable, that things moved slower, that they were more incremental, that nature didn't have to go through these shifts so intensely and so quickly. We're in a place where seeds and plant starts and propagation is happening really fast. There's a lot of movement with air travel and even ship travel and train travel. So the reality is wherever we have destabilized ecosystems, then these invasives and introduced species that are being trucked around are going to find niche environments and they're going to propagate. I say that we need to learn more about these plants and we need to learn more about their traditional uses, where they're from originally, and then we need to embrace these plants. And it's great because herbalists, I love working with invasive plants because I can harvest as much as I want. Now with native plants, I'm very careful and I tend to stand very carefully. And also sometimes I don't harvest from them simply because I know they've been over harvested, they've been poached, or they're in a really delicate ecosystem. So invasive plant medicine is a great way to go, especially for beginners, because I just encourage people with weeds or invasives. I just tell students to have at and to harvest as much as they want, because then it's a win-win for everyone.
Yes, and these plants can be very abundant in places. The crows are agreeing. So as you hear about Albizia in this interview, If you live in the deep south or in other areas where has become invasive, or if you live in an area where it has the potential to overwhelm natives, be careful, very careful if you're planting Albizia. And I think we need to take care as earth stewards not to contribute to native plant loss. But if the plant is already there, it's already invasive in abundance, what can we do with this plant? How can we use it?
Yes, and we can do a lot.
Yeah, and we're going to find out. And I noticed too, and that's something I actually wanted to bring up before, is that when you refer to mimosa, that's actually a common name of albizia, including silk floss tree and the happiness tree, like you said.
Right.
So it sounds like albizia, the conditions for it to thrive, I think it prefers warmth, and it's pretty drought tolerant. And I think it really thrives in disturbed soil, is kind of what you were saying earlier.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and it doesn't mind humidity and moisture as
hmm
well, so it's pretty versatile that way. And a lot of nitrogen fixers are that way. They're very hardy species.
One thing I noticed when I was visiting these trees is that the beautiful flowers are actually really attractive and draw in a lot of bees, birds, butterflies, hummingbirds, and insects. So that's really an upside to this plant.
Oh, pollinators love this plant. Yes, absolutely. And it's interesting. Out of all I used to write for a magazine in the Deep South. I had a regular column,
hmm
and the last article I wrote for them was on mimosa. And out of all the plants I had talked about, this is the one I received the most emails back, regarding the article I wrote. And mostly what these people were telling me about is how they loved mimosa trees when they were growing up. So not only bees and butterflies flock to this tree, but kids and little ones. There's so many people talking about just lingering in the branches and playing with the flowers. There's just, I think, an immediate connection that kids have with this tree. It's almost like a fairyland tree.
Oh,
It's a little unreal.
a lot. It's funny because a lot of the articles I read online, people would remark about their childhoods and the tree. So it's a
Yes.
universal, a universal experience, a universal experience. Do you want to add anything else about how Albizia likes to grow or anything about the plant itself before we move on to the medicinal uses?
You know, I don't really have that much more to add about how it grows. That part of my knowledge is not as strong as my working with it and medicinal use of it.
So let's get started on the medicinal uses of this plant. And I think it has a really long history of being used as medicine.
It does. So I think the first time it appeared in the Materia Medica in traditional Chinese medicine was in the 700s. They called it Huan. So the two parts of the tree that are used are the bark and the flowers. One's called Huan Pi, the bark, or Huan Hua, which is the flowers. And I'm probably doing a terrible job of pronouncing that correctly, but I want to put an effort forward
Mhm.
to honor the system of medicine that has been interacting with it for all these years. And even though it's been on American soil for goodness, almost, well, a little over 300 years now, it still was never in any of the materia medicas. It was never used by the old eclectic physicians here in the U.S. or the physiomedicalists. So it's not until recently, until people have been, probably within the past, I suppose, 40 or 50 years, when more of traditional Chinese medicine and Ayurveda have been coming more into the mainstream, at least within herbalism, that information about its traditional uses have surfaced. So it's been an eye opener for a lot of people to consider the uses of this tree and ways to incorporate it in their self-care and their community care. Yes, as I said, the bark is used and the flowers are used. They have very, very similar properties, the bark and the flowers. For a really simplified version, let me say this about plants and trees in general. Trees in general have more potent medicine than what I find in, ground herbs and, softer, non-woody herbs. Tree medicine is always regarded as quite powerful medicine. And then within the context of the tree, the bark medicine and the root bark medicine is stronger than the flower or the leaf medicine typically. So this is all a very big generalization, but just to give folks an idea. So the bark medicine is definitely more potent than the flowers of the tree. And the medicine is used similarly, but there are some slight differences. I don't know if you have anything else you want to ask or reflect back, because I can go into things a little bit more, but I was going to throw it back at you.
Ooh, I'd love to hear more about the bark. And I just had a question. When you refer to using the bark, are you talking about the bark itself only or also small stems and twigs?
Yeah, normally I like to harvest thumbs width or larger, maybe let's say 2 thumbs width. And then I'll clip that from the tree. I try to do a 45-degree angle to where if there are any drops of water or moisture, it's likely to roll off the tree rather than hang out on a 90-degree or flat end cut. And it's good to harvest something that looks like it needs to be pruned anyway. So out in the wild, it's kind of hard to figure out what that is, but you can look at a tree and see, oh, that's kind of dangling a little awkward over there, or it's interacting with another tree. So I'll harvest that. So I try to be mindful of how I'm harvesting as well. So then after I harvest the bark or the branch, so you can do a branch. I really wouldn't go for, you can use smaller twigs if you want. You would just need to shave that bark off, which would be really challenging. So that's why I like at least a thumb's width, because with a knife, you can peel that bark off. And I will say, after working with a number of different barks, mimosa bark is really easy to peel. So be thankful, because there are some barks like tag alder that's really hard to get off, even with a knife.
Not a good starter bark.
No. And then there's southern prickly ash, which has thorns. So mimosa bark, just like the tree itself, is really kind and really forgiving and really easy. Just, you just make one cut and then you can use your hands to peel it off, actually.
Oh, wow.
And then when you get the stick, when you're done peeling off the bark, the stick itself is just so smooth. It's this light wood. It kind of looks luxurious. You can use that in crafts and projects as well. So I encourage people to do that. So that's how you would harvest the bark. And harvesting the flowers, you would pick the flowers when they're blooming, nothing brown or no flowers that are at the end of their life cycle. So you really want them vibrant. And then you can lay them out on the cloth in a shady, well-ventilated place, or you can put them in a paper bag if there's not too many, and shake that paper bag every now and then, and they'll dry. That's a way to dry the flowers. So I'll get more to medicine making later, but I just wanted to give the basics of that and go back to the medicinal virtues of these plants. So in Western herbalism, how you'll hear of this plant being used has mostly to do with mood and depression and anxiety and insomnia.
Plant for our time now, right?
Yeah, I personally have experience. I normally would make a tincture of the bark and the flowers, and it's heavier on the bark side, but I always like to put the flowers in there, because who wouldn't? All you have to do is look at the tree, and you want to put the flowers in there too. But I really go for the bark myself. And I took a tincture because I literally felt like all the skies were gray. It was just such a dark, heavy, gray feeling. And I can't really remember what was going on that day, but it was late morning. I was in Mississippi, and I reached for my Albizia tincture, and I took a dropper full, And literally within minutes, I felt like the clouds parted and the sun came out.
Wow.
I mean, that's the best way that I can put it. So you can consider this like a mood elevator. If you're on floor 1 and you want to be on floor 5, you can take Albizia. I do want to say that there is one precaution with this plant, actually two. So it can bring on, they have researched it for bringing on uterine contractions. So pregnant women, unless you're ready to birth, this is not the herb for you. And also those who have been diagnosed with bipolar, actually there have been cases where people have taken Albizia and it's had them slip into a manic episode. So people have to be careful with herbs in that regard as well. So this is a pretty gentle herb, but it's not for all forms of mental illness and not for all forms of depression. But your basic gloom and depression, anxiety, someone who's not sleeping well, definitely Mimosa is a really good candidate for that person. I'll give you one example of a woman that came to me. She had lower thyroid count and she had gained a little more weight than she wanted. She was having not severe, not like Raynaud's or anything, but she was having issues with circulation in her hands and her feet and them being slightly cold. Albizia also is really good. So in traditional Chinese medicine, they talk about it enlivening the qi, and qi is energy. So qi is found in the blood. So your qi can be stagnant or it can be, very lifeless. Let's just put it that way. And so Albizia is known to, in a way, it's kind of a blood cleanser and a blood builder. That would be more Western herbalism terms. And in traditional Chinese medicine, they would say it would build qi. So in this woman, when she was talking, I thought, I think Mimosa will be in the formula for her. So I put Mimosa and a couple other herbs. The formula was heavy with Mimosa. That was the leader of the formula. And this woman I didn't hear from for like 6 months. And I was like, oh, okay. And then finally, and this happens to me so many times, and then I think people get slightly freaked out maybe when something works for them so well. And then they kind of distance themselves from me for a little bit, because I've had this happen. I've had people reach out to me 2 years later, things like that. But anyway, she reached back six months later, and she said, wow, that formula really helped. She was like, it shifted her metabolic function. She had more energy to do things. She felt more blood circulation in her hands and feet. And then she started on track to studying herbalism. And she was becoming a community herbalist for her community when she reached out for me, when she reached out to me, that 6-month period after.
Wow.
So that was a big turnaround story, and where I started to see Mimosa as a pivotal herb for thyroid function as well. And, depression in response to lower thyroid function or hypothyroidism.
That's a great story and example of the benefits of Albizia. And like I was saying earlier, I think especially now in this time when a lot of people are undergoing change and stress, and Albizia seems like a very effective and gentle plant remedy.
Yeah, from anything from taking it in tincture form or sipping on the tea of the flowers, what could be more delightful. I will say that both of them are slightly sweet to taste and slightly drying. And there's a little bit of a bitter hit in the taste receptors as well, but it's pretty mild. But yeah, I agree.
Go ahead, sorry.
See that it is a plant for the times. I think especially, it is out here where we have it as an ornamental, but in particular, those in the Southeast where this plant is literally all over the place. And fortunately, there are some trees that are reaching for the sun and they're in, thicker canopies and there's no way you're going to get to the flowers. So it is good news that you can, work with the bark. But there is very few things that are as delightful in terms of harvesting things from the wild than that opportunity you get to harvest flowers from the mimosa tree. Yeah, really, really delightful. And as you're harvesting, like you said, there are pollinators, bees, butterflies, hummingbirds. There's tons of activity going on in the tree. So the experience itself is medicine as well. So, and for those who are experiencing insomnia that leads to the feeling of anxiety, this is a really good herb to work with as well. If you make a tincture or you purchase a tincture of the bark or the flowers or bark and flowers, it would be a dropper full is the typical dosage and about 4 ounces of water. And I will say this, that the bark tends to be a little more grounding and rooting while you are getting that feeling of upliftment. And the flowers are a little more ephemeral, airy. They're a little more upward moving energy. So if you already know of someone who's more of a wind or air constitution, it might be better to give them the bark tincture. So just to put that out there as well, that the bark is definitely a more grounding preparation.
Do you ever do a tincture with bark and flowers, or do you prefer 2 separate tinctures?
Yeah, when I used mimosa bark and flower, I went ahead and put them together. So some people might want to separate them out if they're working with a broader population of people, or if they don't really know how they would respond to the flowers. There are some pretty sensitive people out there energetically, especially with plant medicine. So they might want to tease the 2 out and then try each and then, figure out how they want to combine them. But I like to combine them. And as I said, I would go heavier on the bark. And so it would be like 3/4 bark in terms of my maceration and 1/4 of the flower.
I know in the past we've talked about how you like to make tinctures out of fresh plant material. Do you use fresh albizia in your tinctures?
I prefer making a fresh plant tincture whenever possible. So I've only tinctured fresh plant, fresh bark, and fresh flowers. And I really feel that's the way to go with this plant, unless you're going to be making a tea or decoction, of course. Then you would want to, in China, they soak the bark for a short period of time, not long, maybe 30 minutes or an hour. And then you would take it out of the water and cut it into strips and dry it. And the flowers you can just dry directly and have that available to you when you want to simmer them and enjoy them. Or in terms of the flowers, you could just steep them. For the bark, you would need to simmer it for at least 20 minutes.
The hardest part for me in making the flower tincture was getting the inchworms out of all of the blossoms. There were dozens and dozens.
I had that issue.
At least I think they were inchworms, those little segmented tiny worms.
Yeah.
Those little creatures. I felt so bad. And I just kept thinking, I hope I didn't miss any of you as I'm plopping them into the alcohol.
I know. And then they become sacrificial inchworms.
Yes.
Yeah. So that never was an issue for me. So it must be unique to this region.
I'm not sure if you came across the NIH study on Albizia bark, but the study did show that the dried bark had an antiseptic activity on burns, lessened the severity of pain, lessened inflammation, and burn secretion. So there are studies being done about this plant, which is really exciting.
Well, that makes sense. It has anti-inflammatory properties. And, it is used topically and internally as a mild anodyne. So it does provide mild pain relief. So I could see it working that way as well. And also for any kind of swellings or painful wounds, that's how it's used in China. So it actually has a traditional application. So maybe that's why they decided to study it, given its history and its traditional use.
Interesting. And then as far as, did you ever use the roots of the tree or the seeds in any medicine?
I never use the seeds or the roots. A lot of times the root bark is just a stronger bark than even the bark itself. But there's no traditional reference that I'm aware of that mentions root bark. And there's nothing that mentions the seeds either. Let me know if you find anything out.
I read online that the seed oil is really high in polyunsaturated fatty acids, and so I think they're using it for livestock food. And,
yeah.
Yeah.
The leaves and the leaves.
And the
I
leaves
didn't
are
know
edible,
about
I
the
guess.
seeds,
Yeah.
but the leaves, they use for livestock fodder as well.
I did read that there are conflicting reports about the pods of the Albizia and those can be toxic.
Yeah, because that can be an issue. It is related to some of the acacias. Some of the acacias can be terribly poisoning. Yeah, I think, in the legume family, you'll have like these amazing edibles and you'll have these really toxic species. So it's just something to be careful with, I think. But, given the status of its bark and flowers, I couldn't imagine that it would be, I couldn't imagine it being extremely toxic, maybe mildly, but so much of the tree is already used and such a safe herb,
It was funny because some people online were saying how they would eat the pods in tortillas when they were kids. So it was really interesting to see. And then, someone else wrote almost a whole PhD, it seemed like, that I found online about how it was toxic. So I don't know that whole area. So maybe don't eat the pods if you're listening.
Oh, wow. That's all over the place.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty extreme. Yeah, it could be sometimes toxicity is a matter of preparation. So finding where it's traditional too, and then, just noting the traditional preparation. So sometimes it could, it is in the legume family, so there's probably a lot of enzyme inhibitors in the seeds. So, just look to traditional processes and then go from there. So, and I was trying to think about the source. I've read the person who brought it here brought it from Turkey, and then other references said it was native to Southeast Asia. So I don't know. Did you find any conclusive information that way? Because that would be where to look for traditional preparation.
I read that it was native to Southeast Asia, and it was also used in the traditional medicines of China and Iran.
Yeah, because some sources say the tree is from Persia. So, and I suppose that would make sense. Either way, it would make sense. It would have spread to what was then called Persia, or the other way, it would have gone into Asia. But it does seem like those two areas have a long relationship with the tree. Oh, and I wanted to say as well, and I think this is a nice quality that the tree has, is that the flowers can help increase appetite. So that's one of the traditional uses in traditional Chinese medicine. So I think about cancer patients and having difficulty and lowered appetite, especially if they're going through chemotherapy. And I think this would be a really nice complementary and adjunct therapy for someone who has decreased appetite.
And so if someone wants to experience this plant, and I know we're not prescribing here, but would you say maybe a tea would be a great way to try?
Start?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think always a tea is the best way to start. Something water-based, and that way you can really get the flavor of the plant, and it almost feels to me a little bit more of an intimate experience than with a tincture. So tinctures are just as wonderful. I just feel like water is this really basic and humble medium that everybody has access to, and really brings out the flavor and the qualities of the plant. So both both water and alcohol are the best in terms of menstruums and drawing out all the properties and constituents of a plant medicine. So those two are great. But of course, if you're getting to know the plant and you're really wanting the experience of the plant and the taste, then, even eating a little of the flower and nibbling on a little bit of the bark, and then also simmering and sipping the plant to get to know it that way. You could do a fresh steep of the flowers just to experience that. You could probably explore a glycerite of the flowers, which is vegetable glycerin, as you know, which is sweet. For that preparation, I'll just give the basics. You want 60% vegetable glycerin, 40% filtered or spring water, and put that in a quart jar and cover the plant material until there's about an inch extra of the glycerin water mixture. And then cap that. In a quart jar, you would put the ball jar seal and ball jar ring on there, and put that in a crock pot, surround it with water, and you want that to be on high heat for about 4 hours. You can do that with the bark as well, but I think the flower would be a lot more delightful. So that's for your basic glycerite.
And what about tincture?
For a tincture, you can say 1 to 2, 1 to 3, but I just say in terms of 1 part plant, 2 parts alcohol. But I've always been a folk herbalist. I eyeball things. If I know it's a strong plant, I'm going to make a weaker tincture. Or if I make a strong tincture of that plant, then I make sure to bring the dosage down. This plant is something you don't have to be concerned about. Like I said, it's a very gentle and forgiving plant. So when you're making your tincture, you've taken the bark off the plant and you've picked some flowers. So let's say that we're doing a mixture of both, and you'll put the bark and the flowers in a jar, let's say a quart jar. You want a little space at the top. You want a good bit of space because you're not going to fill this all the way up. But fill the jar about halfway with bark that you've cut down into smaller pieces. Otherwise, it's really just going to stick out of the alcohol, and you don't want oxidation to happen. You want it all below the alcohol line of where the alcohol level is. So after you put about half a quart of bark in there, then add a layer of the flowers. And then I use, it's a 90% alcohol. Let's see, that's 180 proof. So then I'll water that down for this particular preparation to about 75, 80% alcohol. That's something that you can eyeball or you can be more exact with. You can also use 100 proof alcohol, which is 50%, and you can make your tincture from that. That's about the highest that you'll get when you go to an alcohol store, a liquor store, whatever they're called. Everclear is about the highest that you can get. I use an organic alcohol that I like to order in bulk, and then I water that down. But as I said, you can find some Everclear and some 50% alcohol. And if all you can find is 40%, then I say use that as well. You can also just let it sit and tincture longer. So normally I let mine sit, make sure everything's poked down beneath the surface of the alcohol. And you should have roughly about an inch of fluid on top of the plant material, and the plant material should be able to move around freely. It shouldn't all be jammed and squished, because you're going to want all the edges of the plant material to be exposed to the alcohol, so that extraction of the properties and constituents of the plant can be transferred into the alcohol. And then label it accordingly. I always tell people you need to have, where did you collect it? What date did you do this? What's the percentage of alcohol? And what is today's date? You need to have that important information on there.
Otherwise, you have what I have, which are like 4 unknown tinctures in the
Oh,
cupboard. It's terrible. But I was so enthusiastic, and my friend and I, oh, we'll remember.
yeah,
I've
right?
learned the
That's what
hard
you
way.
say
Yes.
until you're like, oh, well, they're all different shades of green,
Yeah.
and oh,
Yeah, poor Lindsay. I've been texting you photos and saying, is this color green normal? That neon green that happened when I made the olive leaf tincture. It's
right, yeah.
that was
And
amazing. Yeah.
since you use 90% alcohol, yes,
Mhm.
you will get some neon colors, like lemon balm. If you tincture with 90%, it is just electric green,
Wow, amazing.
which is fine,
Yeah.
but I tend to think those are just a little too strong
Mhm.
and too heavy on the alcohol. It makes it, if your plant is already drying, I feel like the alcohol makes it even more drying. I try to have a little bit of a lower alcohol content. Now, the only thing that you would want to use for sure, a higher proof alcohol, it needs to be 90 or 95%, would be for resinous materials. Anyway, it could be anything from propolis to a bark or a plant that has a high resin content, and you're wanting to get that into the alcohol. So you're going to need that really, really high alcohol percentage. For most plants, you can use, anywhere from, 50 to 80% alcohol, no problem.
Oh, okay, good to know. And then, Lindsay, how long do you let your Albizia tincture sit?
It would sit there for 8 weeks is
Mhm.
ideal, and longer is fine. A year later and you haven't strained it, you're fine because your plant material is submerged in the alcohol. But yeah, for me, it's a minimum. Like when I was running my apothecary and I was just, slinging herbs like mad, that's the minimum that I would have plants in alcohol was 8 weeks.
That's actually a relief. I'm not always the most prompt at bottling up my tinctures. I just spotted one more use for Albizia in my notes, and it's a friend on Instagram sent me information and said that Albizia can also be used as a yellow dye, a plant dye. And her pictures, they were this gorgeous buttercup yellow.
Oh, that's good to know. That way that you've utilized everything and
Hmm.
not let anything go to waste.
We're actually now getting close to the end of our interview time together, and I'm just curious if there's anything else you want to share with us about this amazing plant.
Yeah, I think that, well, you were asking me earlier,
Hmm.
what's the best way to get to know the plant and, is it a tea? So I'll have to say that if you can, to actually climb up into the tree and sit in the branches for at least 5 minutes just to get to know the tree that way. And I think that'll be the first dose of medicine for you.
That sounds like a really fun way to start to get to know this plant. And I just wanted to remind listeners that they can learn more about Lindsay and read some of her great writing and herbal remedies at lindsaykolasa.com. That's LINDSAYKOLASA.com. Lindsay, I wanted to end with one last question. I know you've spent a lot of your life with plants, using them for healing personally. You've also taught many people about them, including me. And I'm just wondering if you'd like to share with our listeners today, what is it that you gain from working with and engaging with the plant world? And really, what do plants have to offer us right now?
Oh, wow. I think plants, I know, are so hungry to be in relationship with us. I know this. I know that, when I'm walking through a forest and sometimes when I'm walking down the street, especially when I'm walking down the street, to be honest, I feel like the trees and the plants feel almost like orphans. They're standing there and they're saying, please remember who I am. Please interact with me. I'm so far from, my community of plants on the other side of the world or on the other side of the country. And please remember who I am. And in particular, I guess in this example, I'm talking about, these cultivated plants, these ornamental trees and plants, and these invasives. And as well, when I'm in the forest, I feel like they're extending and reaching out and just wanting to be interacted with. If you go through any ethnobotanical resource and you're reading about different communities of First Peoples, they have incredible amount of relationships with various plants for food, for shelter, for medicine, for spiritual and sacred and community observances and rituals. It's just unbelievable the extent of their knowledge and the extent of their relationships with this more than human realm of plants. And I think this is what we have to recover. I remember in my early days with herbalism, about 5 years after my health crisis, back in 2000, I used to go on hikes, and simply the path would be brown and there would be green everywhere and a blue sky. And when I started zooming in and taking in plant medicine, forming relationships with them, all of a sudden the world was multi-dimensional when I would go on hikes or walks in the park. And everything was jumping out at me in ways that I had never experienced before. So I think that, just start with one plant, be curious, give an offering, whether it's seeds or cornmeal or some hair, just offer something and be open to be in conversation and dialogue with these beings, because they really, really want us to remember how to be in relationship with them. And we have a lot to offer each other, both plants and humans. And I think it's just important that we remember that we are to be in relationship with them. That's part of our natural design, and we've co-evolved with them for eternity. And now it's just remembering and approaching them with a lot of humility and curiosity.
Oh, I love that. And I know what you mean about the plants growing on the streets, especially the freeway. Oh my gosh, I always wonder about how those plants are doing. Um, Often when I walk by trees, I'll thank them for their years of service, just air, food, habitat, shade. I just feel like acknowledging the beings that we share the planet with is important. And I really love how you phrased it, is remembering who these plants are. And I think doing so, it really adds also to our lives as well.
Right. Yes, it does. And we talked about this earlier because you mentioned the freeway, that in the Deep South, one place that you'll see all these mimosa trees is along the highways. These are more like 2-lane highways, very small. But in the summer, when I was driving to maybe a conference or a farmer's market or to teach a workshop, in the summer was my favorite because all of the mimosas were flowering their beautiful pink flowers, looking so otherworldly, looking so exotic, and making the trip just that much more enjoyable. So it's definitely just taking it back to mimosa. They have their way of letting us see them and letting us know that they're there for us. So thanks for that reminder. I forgot about how much I would see mimosas along the highway.
And it made your ride that much more enjoyable. It's like, yes,
Oh,
plants.
it did.
Oh, well, I really, really thank you for joining us today and teaching us all about this amazing plant. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Jill. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to The Plant Report. The Plant Report is produced by Jill Cloutier and is a project of Sustainable World Radio. For more podcasts about plants, permaculture, and ecology, visit our website, sustainableworldradio.com, and you can also find us on iTunes, Facebook, and Twitter. The Plant Report is created for educational purposes only and is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any health condition. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to thank the plants for everything they do.